We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to this Antedote Deepcore Text. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
And Jeremy, today we're going to go back to our first, following up on the first Antedote Deepcore Text we did, and that was on the topic of the Israel-China relationship, and we read from, you read from, and we analyzed portions of the book Seeds of Fire, China and the Roots of the War. Can you give the full title, please?
Oh yes, okay. Seeds of Fire. China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas.
Okay, thank you. By Gordon Thomas. And, of course, Gordon Thomas is the now deceased writer who also wrote the book co-wrote the book Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy. And so we read our first Antedote Deepcore Text. We went into portions of Seeds of Fire, which dealt with aspects of nuclear intrigue between China and Israel, particularly at the nuclear laboratory in Los Alamos in New Mexico. And here in this Deep Core, we're going to read more from Seeds of Fire, but more as it relates to aspects related to biological warfare. So, Jeremy, do you want to give a little more of just a bit of an overview of what we're going to be discussing as we get into, I guess this will be part 2 of Seeds of Fire, following up on our first show, getting into the China-Israel relationship and why it's important to understand like what is and is not going on with regards to this, and how much that would matter on a geopolitical perspective, how much that matters even from an American perspective. Yes,
and we will continue this series of the Antedote Deepcore Text specifically in relationship to China and Israel, and after this we will begin to maybe back up a little bit in terms of a little bit deeper history, maybe more geopolitics, macroeconomics, cyber, Talpiot, all of that kind of stuff. And then the other thing that we want to touch on as we move forward in the next few weeks, and maybe this will not be specifically under the rubric of a Deepcore Text, but more in relationship to the question of the origins and the motive of COVID or SARS-CoV-2 as a virus, but then the COVID-19 pandemic as it's been deployed in terms of the so-called response to it. And there are resonances, I would say, definitely with the anthrax attack, and where we are now seeing in the last weeks to months the same journalistic institutions such as the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal that in the fall of 2001, in the direct wake of the anthrax attack on sitting U.S. senators who were considering what to do in the wake of September 11th, including the questions of the Patriot Act, the most anti-constitutional aspects of the Patriot Act, and bam, get hit by high-grade anthrax that had these letters, right? Obviously, looking back, total frame jobs of a sort of silly proportion, actually, in terms of like the scrawled handwriting, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. And even when, what's his name, John Yoo, came to the Dole Institute over here in Lawrence, Kansas, maybe that was 2012, something like that. I asked him directly about this anthrax attack, and he disclosed that he said he knew it wasn't a terrorist attack, is the way he put it, I think. And I'll try to find that video, and maybe we can release it on the Antedote YouTube channel. And that reminds me, by the way, go the next installment of John Swinn's documentary on the deep, I'll call it the deep history of the United States, the security state, and all of that. has been released on the Antedote channel. So go check that out. Go support us all on our Patreon page. But John Yoo, when he was here, basically admitting at some level that he didn't consider it a terrorist attack. I reminded him it was obviously a terrorist attack. It was meant to politically, it was against civilians, right? U.S. senators for political reasons using, weapons. And so it was obviously a terrorist attack. And he then basically said, well, I knew that it didn't seem like it was Al-Qaeda. So sort of hinting that he knew it was some kind of other job of some sort. And I then reminded us, like, well, someone wanted us to think it was some kind of, Islamo-fundamentalist, jihadi of some sort with the death to Israel, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great, scrawled on it. And so that was about as far as that conversation went, but I thought it was an interesting disclosure. And so in the wake of that, and remember the run-up to that is, if you see the run-up to September 11th as what was going on with all of this real estate transfer, who was taking trips to Israel in the run-up to September 11th out of high positions in the New York municipal government, for example, and we'll touch back on that as we approach the 20th anniversary of September 11th. In the run-up to the anthrax attacks, of course, you have the Dark Winter terror drill in the summer of 2001, which includes a whole bunch of eventually directly seen sketchy people, such as Judith Miller in the role of the reporter, and James Woolsey playing the role of the director of Central Intelligence, Jerome Hauer playing, I believe, the role of the head of Health and Human Services, I believe. So we'll go back to that as we drill down a little bit more on September 11th. But I just wanted to bring out that there is this resonance right now as what's being called in the media and all around social media. There's a meme, and it's the lab leak theory. The lab leak theory. Okay, and so the way that I talk about it more accurately is the lab origin hypothesis. The COVID lab origin hypothesis would be the way to talk about it, I think, more accurately. And meanwhile, you have these same organs, as I mentioned before, as the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, who in the wake of the anthrax attacks on sitting U.S. senators, where the strain was apparently came from the bowels of the U.S. military biological warfare lab scene, but the technology, which was included things like nanosilica that was used, it looks like, to make sure that it was highly aerosolized, very advanced, and when the letters would open, for example. The first published record that I've seen of that technology is Israeli scientists in 2006, really. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the United States didn't have that. The United States government probably did have that technology too. But I just do think it's interesting that the nanosilicate technology looks like it was first published in the public domain by Israeli scientists. And then there's this other piece to this that we'll get into more in the future, but I just want to briefly mention this, that if you go back to the so-called Michael Kadar case ramping up in 2016 into 2017 with these hundreds of terrorist threat calls to Jewish community centers and schools and all kinds of different Jewish community installations all around the North America, but also around the world, that was then blamed on Michael Kadar. It looks like Michael Kadar's mother is Tamar Kadar, who works in the Israeli Biological Warfare Institute at Nes Ziona, which is going to come back up as we begin to read through Seeds of Fire here. So my final point in terms of what we may touch on in the future, in terms of really taking on and drilling down on the origins of both SARS-CoV-2 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Two different things, but related, obviously. And how seeing it through a prism of the anthrax attacks might be very, very helpful in sorting out who are these people who are just pointing the finger directly at the Wuhan lab and the leak out of the Wuhan lab. And this is China and only China, and it's just likely just a leak. And that some of these, even some of them are actually the exact same people who are writing these articles in 2001, pointing the finger at Saddam Hussein for things such as the anthrax attack. And remember, that was the first line of attack by these kinds of players, including like people like James Woolsey, that this was, remember, a lot came down to the question of, was it the bentonite clay was the substrate for the anthrax, which in many ways actually hid the fact that the high grade anthrax was based on this nanosilicate technology that I aforementioned, that was first published by Israeli scientists, it looks like to me. So that's the point that I just wanted to draw out here before we get into this Seeds of Fire aspect of the biological warfare relationship between China and Israel. That there were these people, and definitely these same publications, who were pointing the finger at Saddam Hussein for the anthrax attacks, and ultimately they got what their policy desire was, right, in terms of the Iraq War. And we have uncovered a lot of the background of who did the Iraq War, why, and how things such as the Epstein-Maxwell network were apparently seemingly at the heart of that too. So, all right, let's delve into Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas, to get into a few of these. There's this little hidden gems of raw intelligence information in the back of this book. So we're going to read through pages, let's see here, I have this written down, 478 through 481. And this book, I believe, was published in 2001. Yeah, copyright 2001 by Gordon Thomas.
So was it published before September 11th or just after?
That's a good question. It must have been... that's a great question, Greg.
Because, like, this is very interesting, because, like, this is what we're going to read from here. We went over this a little bit. We went over this. We read through this together before we started recording. And I mean, this is stuff that, like, I honestly don't know if this has been covered anywhere else, but it raises some. Well, we'll talk about as we read through this and analyze it. I mean, this raises very interesting questions regarding the nature of some of the current aspects of course, we've talked about China, the war on terror, China, and how it deals with its own, Muslim populations as it relates to Uyghurs and to its own ethnic minorities, and we'll get into it. But this stuff we're reading, I don't know. Maybe it's been covered somewhere else, but like, if it has, it's been. To say there's been little coverage would be an understatement.
Oh, Greg, here's what I think happened, is that it was originally published January 15th, 2001. Wow. And then it was republished at the end of 2005. Because I remember it seemed like he included stuff about, and this is where I believe some of the disinformation in here comes in, is he included stuff about bin Laden and 9/11 in here, but that must have been then brought in the later edition, actually.
Very, very, very interesting. Very interesting.
Okay, so we will go to page 478. Remember, the beginning of this book that we focused on is when George Tenet, then Director of Central Intelligence for the as a holdover for the then incoming George W. Bush administration, was going to brief the new administration on these things he was looking at, which included aspects of Israeli intelligence connections in a European theater with the Red Mafia, the Russian mob, and questions of trucking and bartering in nuclear black market materials, which will again come into focus as we head towards 9/11 again.
It's so funny and it's so telling how those same dynamics continue popping up. Israel and the Red Mafia, etc., ad nauseum in all of these topics as it relates to all these countries and all these aspects that, good Americans are not supposed to, good patriotic Americans are not supposed to talk about unless they want to start a new world war.
Right. That's our perpetual joke, is if you just if you bring up any facts about the questions of what we could call the Russian deep state or the Chinese deep state, then we are advocates for World War III and war hawks and all of that. Even if we continue to point out how this is all entangled in this global criminal establishment, with much of the elements here in the United States at the commanding heights themselves.
We want to start the six world wars that Trump stopped John Bolton from launching by bringing him into office. By bringing him in. No, yeah. But in all seriousness, I mean, we still aren't supposed to talk about these things, even though all of this goes back to, the country, particularly, or particular aspects, more extreme ideological components of a country that so many of these people say that they are the most principled in opposition of. So anyway.
All right. So the one other thing I want to say is that the other part of the earlier part of the book that we dealt with and also in this later part of the book where it deals with what is alleged to have been a Chinese and Israeli conjoined intelligence operation that used we haven't yet figured out or read from the parts that describes how the Promise software was used, but apparently it was what's alleged in the book by Thomas is that Robert Maxwell sold the Promise the Israeli backdoor Promise software to the Chinese originally. And then the Chinese had worked on it for a long, long time and gotten it into a place where they then thought that they could use it for this conjoined operation, which was what you had originally said in your introduction, had to do the Israeli and Chinese intelligence operation against the heart of the U.S. nuclear laboratories, Los Alamos, and which included apparently a breach of the X division at the heart of that, which includes apparently the disks, the hard drives that contain the schematics, probably the CAD drawings and things like that for the DOE's Department of Energy's Nuclear Bomb Squad, NEST, Nuclear Emergency Security Team, which, by the way, was out of the country for the first time in 3 years on September 11th, doing disable a terrorist nuclear device in a European theater under the operation name Jackal Cave, which is almost never talked about at all in 9/11 truth circles or anywhere really. And I think that's a glaring fact that needs to be dealt with when you bring it back to the hard forensics of South Manhattan and Ground Zero on September 11th. But that was apparently compromised in this attack that by Israeli and Chinese intelligence. Remember, this is also in the run up to September 11th that all of this goes down, and these drives that have the schematics for how to undo nuclear devices and all of this are apparently accessed in terms of this operation that is alleged to have used this Chinese re-engineered version of the Maxwell supplied Promise software that had been given an Israeli backdoor to it. And so that I think that's a crucial piece to this. So now we're going to get into the biological aspects of this relationship, because that is as a serious a nuclear relationship as you can imagine, don't you think? Like using this compromised technology that came out of the American software scene and the Hamiltons, but then was going to be utilized by the U.S. Department of Justice. there's a whole backstory there in terms of how the Hamiltons were abused by the DOJ, it looks like. But then that software was then utilized by this conjunction operation of China and Israel to compromise the data of the Department of Energy's nuclear bomb squad, basically. And remember, of course, we keep pointing this out. This needs to be pointed out. What is the geography of the heart of the U.S. nuclear weapons scene is New Mexico. Where is the other key site of the Epstein-Maxwell network is the Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, just less than an hour away from these labs. And who was the governor, who was both the governor of New Mexico and the head of the Department of Energy that is actually in charge of the nuclear weapons themselves? Bill Richardson, and obvious connection to the Epstein-Maxwell network there. So that needs to be brought up over and over again too.
And going back to you mentioned Inslaw and the whole Promise software and the basically the taken out of the hands of the original founder of Inslaw Incorporated. That whole drama with William Hamilton and that whole drama with the involving Promise ending up with regards to Reagan administration. The man at the center of that would have been as the Attorney General. You mentioned Department of Justice as the Attorney General was Edwin Meese, primary player like in right wing circles, Council for National Policy circles, direct mentor of Mark Levin. So a lot of major players. Just another aspect of this long-term operation going on there with Edwin Meese being at the center of like the intrigue around this company Inslaw and its founder and the theft of this technology. And so
very good. All right. Well, thank you for bringing in. Those domestic elements are crucial. Obviously, Edwin Meese, for example, or Senator John Tower as Maxwell's key asset to get all of this done in an American context.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what would have happened if John Tower had been brought in as Secretary of State.
Whew. All right, finally to some reading. Antedote Deepcore Text, not Antedote Deepcore, our opinions on the matter. But here we go. All right, page 478 of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Okay, I'm going to start at the very top, and we'll just go through this. Quote, the late Robert F. Kennedy, then Attorney General and President Kennedy's overseer of the agency, had once witheringly called Langley, quote, the home of the only Secret Service to advertise its presence on the freeway, unquote. Tennett's caller, in a throwback to the lingua franca of the Cold War days, was typically obtuse. He simply said, quote, the jumper is coughing, unquote. It was the call that Tenet had been waiting for during the past 2 months. On that frosty morning in January 2001, Senior Colonel Xu Shunping, that's XUJUNPING, of China's People's Liberation Army and one of his nation's new breed of military high flyers, a strategist with fluent English and a year at Harvard University on his CV, had defected to the United States. Xu had simply caught a China Airlines flight to Bangkok. From there, he had booked a business class seat on Thai Airlines to New York. Next, he had boarded the shuttle to Washington, D.C. From the capital's national airport, Xu, used one of the few quarters in his pocket to call an unlisted number. It was the one he had been given by a CIA agent in Beijing. Xu told the man at the other end of the phone who he was and why he was in Washington. Within an hour, a government unmarked car had collected Xu and whisked him from the airport to a CIA safe house in a Washington suburb. So important was Xu's defection that President George W. Bush was immediately informed by the director. Tenet called it, quote, the best news we have received out of China for a long time, unquote. Given his importance, Xu was afforded all the courtesies of a top-level defector. He was allowed to order in the finest cuisine to the safe house. His quote-unquote handlers, the team of interrogators assigned to debrief him, were told by Tenet to, quote, take things at Shu's pace, unquote. For weeks, Shu revealed little other than what the CIA either needed confirming or already suspected. Shu chose to open his debriefing with news which brought a wry smile to the lips of his listeners. He told them that Israeli scientists trained at the PLA's Super Secret Intelligence and Security Command in the Western Hills outside Beijing had been trained to perfect the technique of morphing, among others, the images of Yasser Arafat and Saddam Hussein onto television screens. Using specially doctored voice tapes of the actual Arafat and Saddam speaking, these have been re-spliced and perfectly lip-synced so that either leader appears to be making totally outlandish statements against their own people, which could lead to them being toppled. Shu had witnessed these closed-circuit test transmissions later carried out deep inside the Kiryat, Israeli Defense Forces headquarters in Tel Aviv. The transmissions could be relayed to both PLO and Iraqi television stations. They would then replace real-time programs and cause panic, anger, and havoc. The CIA debriefing team knew this development was an extension of what had been done by the United States 193rd Operations Group during the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Then a specially converted 737 flew over Iraq and broadcasted reports directly into Baghdad radio stations, urging Iraqi soldiers to desert before the next bombing. Shu's debriefers had been more interested to learn that other Israeli scientists had returned from China with the capability to arm Shin Bet agents with radioactive aerosol sprays that their Chinese counterparts had shown them how to create. These had been used in the Second Intifada, still raging in Israel. The debriefers were shocked to hear Shu admit that the sprays contained scandium-64, an element whose side effects include creating impotency in a male and severely damaging the fallopian tubes of a woman. He said that when PLO dissidents were arrested and taken to an Israeli police station or detention center, they were strip-searched. Their clothes were then given a small squirt from an aerosol that contained the radioactive chemical. The chemical was invisible, odorless, and left no detectable residue on the clothes. It also quickly penetrated skin. A small squirt of the substance enabled Israeli agents and Defense Force quote-unquote snatch squads to detect a person previously arrested. Shu explained this was done by Israeli detector vans equipped with ultra-sophisticated Geiger counters that pinpointed a person previously sprayed. The vans were identical to those already used by Israeli Defense Force patrols. The Chinese-trained Israeli scientists had set up a lab to make aerosol and detector equipment at Israel's top-secret Institute for Biological Research, situated in the Tel Aviv suburb of Nes Ziona. Most of its 12 acres of laboratories were underground and protected by state-of-the-art security systems. Unquote. I just want to add in one thing that I'd forgotten to say before about why I'd brought up the Michael Kadar and then his mother. I can't remember her name, but I have. There is one.
I think you said it was a Tamar
Kadar. Yeah, thank you. It seems to rhyme. And remember, he was accused. Michael Kadar was accused of doing these hundreds of these calls, these sort of terrorist hoax calls, as they were called, and then apparently caught. But his mom worked at this institute, this biological warfare institute in Israel that's being talked about in Seeds of Fire here. The other thing about it, though, is that she had worked in the United States. She'd come to the United States in the early 90s, I think. And it looks like to me on the surface of it that she was part of the crew that was called, that did the Philip Zach crew, the Dr. Philip Zach crew, the one that had done the Camel Club, who had made racial fun, it looked like, of their fellow Arab, I think he was of Egyptian national background, scientist at one of these facilities. But it looks like to me that Tamar Kadar, Michael Kadar's mother, apparently, it was was in the United States at the time that some of these breaches took place. That's what it looks like to me. I haven't yet pinned that down, and I think it's an interesting piece potentially of the potential origin, the hypothesis of some of the origins of the anthrax attack. It may not be correct, but there's some pieces there. And if you go look at it, you can find, I dug a little bit and I found Tamar Kadar even to a much more current day in the 2000s, maybe even in the teens somewhere, on a U.S. Army sponsored, maybe U.S. AMRID white paper imprints in relationship to things around biodefense and other kinds of things. So I just think it's a very interesting connection there. And remember, we've continued to focus on one of the, if not the first, one of the very first finger pointers directly at the China lab leak theory, really, was Israeli biological warfare long time, I think, a Lieutenant Colonel Danny Shoham.
Yes, it was Danny Shoham in the Washington Times. Then you've got Tom Cotton, Tucker Carlson, et cetera, all running with this. And this is also right around the time that Steve Bannon, Committee on the Present Danger China, launches and ramps up into high gear the whole War Room Pandemic podcast. Whole War Room Pandemic, which just seemed to be to prove that China is responsible for unleashing this virus that shut the world down. So. And one more thing I'm wondering as we're reading through this, and this is just me speculating as we're listening and reading about, is it's interesting these Israelis being trained in China. It sounds like by people within the being trained by within the People's Liberation Army in China. And it makes me wonder, similarly, we've talked about Talpiot, the high tech in Israel, and the very Russian nature of a lot of aspects of Israeli high tech. Or as you told the person on the Clubhouse room you were in a while back, described basically, Israel almost being as Russia's Silicon Valley. And then you have this aspect with China.
That was a Palestinian woman who said that. Yeah.
Yes, a Palestinian, which makes it that which is super interesting to hear that being discussed in that context. And then on top of this military, what's going on here with the China? I wonder. I don't know how much information's out there, but I wonder how deep this strain runs. If Israelis being trained in China for aspects of things, and vice versa. And then also interesting, I believe it's going to come up in the process of reading this also, is the factor of South Africa, the apartheid state of South Africa, of course, which in many cases Israel is being compared to, although we could argue, it's not the time to get into a debate about, what, is Israel worse? It's not, leaving all that aside, the whole topic of that's one of the things that a lot of people don't seem to want to discuss today is the nature of the relationship between more of the ideological hardline components within Israel, within the Israeli state, and South Africa. So, but I do wonder about this whole, similar to Israel and Russia that we've identified, how much of a Chinese nature to some of these aspects of trading and all that. I wonder how deep that goes, and maybe in the future, answers could start to come out about that, or maybe there's some more information that we haven't stumbled upon that gives more information about more details on this regard. I was just thinking about that as you were reading.
Yes, I mean it is interesting that this kind of relationship between China and Israel is much more covert, obviously. I mean, this has been, up until more recently, this very deep relationship technologically, but also this military relationship, obviously, which is being exposed here, has been much more covert, obviously, than the direct U.S.-Israel special relationship, which is, much of it has been out in the open to some large extent in terms of at least the military backing and large portions of the intelligence backing and that relationship. Now, of course, there's all of these aspects of especially American history where the Israeli involvement, especially the deep domestic events, are not still not from the 60s. We still barely can talk about the who did the Kennedy assassination and why, where you have a known agent of Israeli military intelligence, specifically a man who helped organize the smuggling of nuclear triggers out of Southern California in the United States, Arnon Milchan, as the executive producer of the quote-unquote conspiracy theory drama movie about the killing of an American president. And to me, it's just such a direct fact that has to be grappled with. Does it explain the whole story? No, I don't think so, but it's a pretty serious fact to be reckoned with. So obviously there's this covert history between the United States and Israel, that including up to things like a killing of an American president, or all the way up through September 11th. You can't really talk publicly about this aspect of the quote-unquote U.S.-Israeli special relationship. But this kind of thing, where there's obviously this sharing of intelligence and military assets and all of that, has been very open between the United States and Israel. And so this much more covert relationship, and what's interesting actually is that it's almost, there's an aspect of it where there's an inverse, where on the surface in the United States, it looks like the policies are aligned at some level, right? The United States is always the one who's going to veto on behalf of Israel at the UN Security Council, or those kinds of global policy votes. But behind the scenes, there's very high level actual pushback to some extent, or at least concern. If you're thinking about, one of the three main things that then Director of Central Intelligence George Tenet wanted to brief the incoming George W. Bush administration on was this Israel and China relationship of this penetration of nuclear laboratories, but also the dangers of Israeli intelligence working with the Red Mafia in a European theater in terms of nuclear black market materials. Okay, so that's obviously happening. That's some kind of policy concern. But overt direct military support and intelligence support for Israel from the United States with the China and Russia, it's almost the opposite, where on the surface the overt policy aspects are that they vote against. They're voting against the Iraq War. They're voting against Israeli acts against the Palestinians often. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, there's this really deep, fairly covert military intelligence and increasing technology and economic relationship between Israel and China, and Israel and Russia. And so I think that needs to be factored in here, that all is not as it seems or seemed on the surface. And we probably won't deal with it on this recording of Antedote Deepcore Text, but we are going to move into this key figure in both the relationship between Israel and China military intelligence, but also apparently at the core of the fixed frame of what looks like the September 11th operation. And this would be Shaul Eisenberg, which we will go into more, especially in terms of understanding September 11th. But Shaul Eisenberg is this key figure in terms of Israeli intelligence in the entirety of the Asian sphere. He is apparently the guy who organizes this first major covert visit by top-level Israeli military and intelligence officials to China. I believe that's 1979. I can't remember, but I think so. The 1979 is this key year to understand all these things.
Oh, yeah, lots of things going on in 1979. It almost seems like the year in which, like, basically, like, you had the real shifting away from, like, what had been the war against, European communism and on to the war, what would become the War on Terror.
Right, and so the two key moments of the War on Terror in 1979 really are obviously the relationship of Iran and the United States, and the Iranian Revolution, and the usage of the hostage crisis, which was really sort of the first big volley of the war on terror for an American television audience, on and on, day after day, day 400. And of course, it works to install Reagan and George H.W. Bush, which, according to Iranian national whistleblowers like Farah Mansour, go look up his article, the article based on his research by Harry Martin from 1991, I think it's around then, about the facts that point to this George H.W. Bush faction inside of the CIA that actually facilitated the hostage crisis. They didn't just take advantage of it. They didn't just let it, sort of let it proceed as the limited hangout story is, and then solved it behind Carter's back as Reagan comes in, and then they're released. I think they're released on the day of the inauguration, I believe, right? I mean, we should delve into that more, but no, they actually orchestrated it, it looks like, and that they also then apparently orchestrated the political rise of Khomeini, and then supplied him with lists of potential political enemies, many of them which were maybe thousands, which were very likely the targets of political assassinations, which would include students, secular political critics, leftists of different sorts. Maybe I'm not even sure, but it's very possible that even some of his, religious cleric rivals potentially could have been part of those circles that were taken out via intelligence supplied by this network. So that's one key moment. That's really the beginning of the modern age of terror, at the very least. I mean, of course, Menachem Begin, maybe a few years earlier, when questioned by a journalist, said, well, how does it feel to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And he said, the Middle East, the father of terrorism in the entire world, right? So obviously, in many ways, the rise of Israel was concomitant and done on the basis, and I would assert has been maintained via terrorism as the key political modality. And the second prime minister of Israel, Moshe Sharet, the book talking about his diaries describes how there was this specific choice by some of the set that, of course, people like Shimon Peres, the godfather of the Israeli bomb, the original handler of Arnon Milchan in terms of Lechem and Israeli military intelligence, scientific bureau of liaison, warfare intelligence group, which included nukes, but also biology, that this group, and that would also include that Perez was aligned also with what would be considered more of the right wing that eventually became the Likud leaders in Israel, to terrorize the West. And I can't remember the name of that, of Moshe Sharet's, the book about Moshe Sharet's diaries. We should read from that at some point. It's very interesting. Okay, here it is. It's called Israel's Sacred Terrorism, a study based on Moshe Sharet's personal diary and other documents, by Livia Rokash, with a foreword by Noam Chomsky. All right, so we'll get into that another time. But just, thinking back about this, the maybe the late modern age of terror is the Iran crisis, and then the Jerusalem conference organized by Benjamin Netanyahu, which really in many ways also represents the rise of the Likud party into power, and into global power, when you begin to think about it as the architects of the eventual global war on terror seem to be centered around someone like Netanyahu and the rise of Likud in Israeli politics. So those two pieces, I think, are like the the policy event of the burgeoning modern age of the War on Terror, and then the actual political event, which was the Iran crisis, right? That then folds into, of course, the Iran-Contra and all of that in the 80s.
And all of that deep information regarding like the nature of the Iranian Revolution. And I haven't had a chance to look too closely at this, and I'm not going to stay on this because, it's not the topic tonight. But it is interesting with the current events in Iran, with the new. And I need to look closer. I think we need to look closer at the recent Iranian election. But the new president-elect of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, another hardliner, very much more in the mold of like what you would consider like the Iranian hardliners to be than say a Hassan Rouhani. And it's interesting in this moment that you've got another what appears to be a hardliner taking power in Iran. We'll see where that goes, but there's been a precedence in a history of the hardliners really playing into the hand, or at least the rhetorical hardliners really playing into the hands of those who want to perpetuate a war on terror, clash of civilizations, whatever you want to call it. So,
all right, thank you. And the article that I was referencing is titled "The Real Iranian Hostage Story from the Files of Farah Mansour." It's Fara Mansoor by Harry V. Martin, Free America, and this was 1995 basically. And I'll just say the two I'll just quote real briefly here, and then we'll link to this article, and then eventually we'll deal with some of this a little bit more deeply. But okay, quote, "To really understand the hostage crisis and who done it, one has to look not only with a microscope but also a wide-angle lens to have a panoramic view of this well-scripted drama," Mansour states. That drama was the result of large historical patterns, models, and motives. Once its true nature is understood, it will be clear how Iran-Contra happened, why Rafsanjani has been trying to move toward the West, and why Reagan called him a moderate, and why during the Gulf War, James Baker said, "We think Iran has conducted itself in a very, very credible way through this crisis." Mansour emphasizes that the quote-unquote October surprise myth has served as dangerous misinformation. Thousands of documents in support. With thousands of documents to support his position, Mansour says that the quote-unquote hostage crisis was a political quote-unquote management tool created by the pro-Bush faction of the CIA and implemented through an a priori alliance with Khomeini's Islamic fundamentalists, unquote.
This would basically be what was known as Team B, which was used to basically counteract the incoming Carter administration.
Yes. This is how that all fits in. So this was the hot aspect of that, and that's what you also then see with like September 11th, where the Vulcans or the neocons, the people that were maybe more associated even with George H.W. Bush, were wary of in their surrounding of George W. Bush. At least allegedly, they were wary of it. And then bam, 9/11. And then, of course, you have Wesley Clark calling it a policy coup. Yes, it was a policy coup, but it was also a policy coup based on a military operation, a hot coup, where you have buildings being blown up on live television, basically, right? So it's similar to this, I'd say. And so last thing here is he says that the purpose was twofold, quote, to keep Iran intact and communist free by putting Khomeini in full control, and to, quote, destabilize the Carter administration and put George Bush in the White House. All right. That's that. We'll link to that. There's a lot more there, and there's a whole timeline of how it all went down.
And one more thing I wanted to pick up on what you mentioned, and I think we'll tie back into the into what we're reading from Seeds of Fire. Ultimately, you mentioned before when we were you mentioned the fact that like the U.S.-Israel relation, it's so overt, out in the open. The U.S. seen as the protector of Israel and all this. And then with Russia and China in particular, with the outward appearances that these are the countries that oppose Israel publicly, that will condemn Israel within like the United Nations, while the U.S. acts to block any type of condemnations or any type of like actual substance behind any condemnations. And we've talked about this before, and we'll talk about it again in the future. I'm not going to delve this very long, but it's just that is a that is a point that I think really ultimately I think it confuses a lot of people in that regard, and that, like, outwardly, that the U.S. with this obvious, like, overt relationship with Israel, but in a lot of cases people don't take into consideration the very real policy wars that go on over Israel within, like, within our own establishment, within our own political system, etc. And then these much more covert. I mean, even, like, as much as is known about, like, the Russian nature of Israel, not nearly enough has really been delved into regarding that. But then also even this much more hidden, I would say, like, much more covert, still in the shadows history of, like, China and Israel that we're discussing here, that very much, I think, ultimately belies, like, this image of countries like Russia and China being seen publicly because, like, they'll stand with the countries of the world at the United Nations or whatever. Well, ultimately, though, it ultimately seems like a lot of those, for all, like, the Russian condemnations of Israel at the UN, I don't know how far they actually go, but that outward face of being seen as that. And a lot of this type of information, if this is true, and a lot of it can be, I think, ultimately corroborated. You can even tie it into aspects of our current events that's going on from a geopolitical perspective, what we've been talking about with multipolarity and a shifting of global power, is that a lot of this other information that is really not that well known or that well much covered belies, I think, these public images, but it's kind of difficult to convey that in an environment where criticism of, like, or critical conversations about countries like Russia and China are largely discouraged or frowned upon within, like, a quote-unquote alternative media environments and settings, and where, like, it's so obvious, like, you could point to your own country's corruption, and then so the outwardness of, like, solidarity with, like, the nations of the world against the Zionist behemoth, that a lot of this ultimately belies that, but it has become something that is really not conveyed or discussed or covered nearly, obviously, as extensively or as in detail oriented as it should be and needs to be.
Yes, I agree, Greg. And it's interesting because, like, even when you think about if it's also the case that this that really that the Islamic Republic in Iran was orchestrated at some level. That was the second Iranian coup by these elements of the CIA. I mean, that first of all is fairly startling to the public common understanding of that event. Basically, it's sort of, at the most, it's seen as blowback to what happened in relationship to the first coup, 1953, Operation Ajax. The overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh, the installation of the Shah, the training of the Shah's secret police by, I believe, both the United States and Israel, actually, and then out of nowhere, it's sort of no one could have imagined kind of scenario like Condoleezza Rice on September 11th with the rise of Khomeini. But then, thinking back on then the complexity of this aspect of that relationship, and this then in relationship to what you were talking about these other deeper aspects of Russia, China, Israel, that are hidden behind the common understandings, the public proclamations, the votes in the UN, and all of that, it is possible that there is some kind of, at least from an American context, American perspective, there might be actual blowback in relationship to this operation, the American aspect of this operation to allegedly install Khomeini in the beginning of the Iranian Islamic Republic, where you then see it play out as where it becomes an actual potential tension that continues to pop up. And then how does that tension play theatrically, of course, between Israel and Iran? Iran was obviously the kind of nemesis that someone like Netanyahu needed.
If we didn't have an Iran, we would have to invent it.
There you go. Right. It's right. There you go.
Particularly in Iran, so much as if there were no mullahs, we would have to invent them.
So who knows? This is something that I don't think is easy to figure in terms of, is there actual real blowback from an American perspective with the actions in relationship to Iran? Is Iran an actual something like a nemesis? It became an actual nemesis out of this, where it began to be at least a little bit more independent from its intelligence orchestrators and original patrons from Central Intelligence, maybe. I don't know, but these are things that should be considered. But the way that the whole theater has grown in relationship to the war on terror and Russia, China, Iran, Israel, the United States, the Belt Road Initiative, all of that is there's aspects of this that need to be seen, I think, in a longer term dynamic. And this is one of the things that we also want to begin unpacking more and more and more from an American perspective, in terms of who are these key figures who play out this history in this way. People like James Jesus Angleton, Henry Kissinger, these key people, are they who they are said to be? In the case of Henry Kissinger, just some kind of pig-headed, warmongering U.S. imperialist. In the case of James Jesus Angleton, just gone a little bit over the top, hard-nosed Cold Warrior, trying to uncover the monster plot that the Soviets have deployed with his incredible whistleblower, who turns out to be the only Soviet defector that he believes is truthful, Anatoly Golitsyn. And remember, the key piece of this, and we'll have to delve more into this aspect too, to really understand then, if this is all a ruse, let's say, and if someone like Angleton is not just has this dirtied up relationship with the Israelis, but potentially with the Soviets, and very close with Philby, very high level there. Then what is actually then going on with this relationship between Angleton and his prized Soviet defector, who then gives him all of this information to help paralyze the American counterintelligence establishment for many, many years, while also never really catching anybody significant. And by the way, one of the first immediate key effects, it looks like, of the Angleton-Golitsyn relationship is the throwing out of the potential earlier Golanowski input, I believe, where Golanowski apparently has the files on Bohr Kissinger, Heinz Kissinger, as a long-term Soviet agent from way back in his days as a U.S. Basically a U.S. counterintelligence army officer of some sort in relationship to post-World War II and the Nazis. And then how does Operation Paperclip fit into all of that? The Reinhard Gehlen aspect, the relationship then between Gehlen and Israel, and the rat lines to the United States. Angleton was a key piece of that, but then Operation Underworld and the usage of like the Meyer-Lansky criminal syndicate with the global reach of it too, in terms of an European theater. And then how that was then the key trucking and bartering, the trucking and bartering aspect of the black economy of the creation of Israel's original weaponization. Mickey Cohen, Meyer-Lansky's lieutenant from L.A., who is apparently very close with the man who then goes and shoots the apparent Soviet defector Patsy, Lee Harvey Oswald, right? So there's a whole, Jack Rubenstein. It looks like he's a key part of the Mickey Cohen, thus Meyer-Lansky network. So there's a whole network going on here that needs to be unpacked, and we want to continue doing it from this American perspective so we can understand what all is going on to this day in terms of these much larger global geopolitical dynamics that would have to include Israel as an epicenter, but also then these more covert relationships to the east, to Iran, but then also Russia and China. All right.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, cool. So back to Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Page 479, about halfway down. We've just, I'm going to just reread this real short paragraph where we stopped. Quote, the Chinese-trained Israeli scientists had set up a lab to make aerosol and detector equipment at Israel's top-secret Institute for Biological Research, situated in the Tel Aviv suburb of Nes Ziona, and that's spelled N-E-S, then Z-I-O-N-A. Most of its 12 acres of laboratories were underground and protected by state-of-the-art security systems. Within its laboratories and workshops are manufactured a wide range of chemical and biological weapons. The Institute's chemists, some of whom once worked for the Soviet KGB or East German Stasi intelligence services, had a current research program which included developing a range of pathogens which could be, according to a secret CIA report, quote-unquote ethnic specific. The CIA report claims that the Institute scientists were, quote, trying to exploit medical advances by identifying distinctive genes carried by some Arabs to create a genetically modified bacterium or virus. Still at the early stages, the intention is to exploit the way viruses and certain bacteria can alter the DNA inside their host's living cells, unquote. This research mimics work conducted by South African scientists during the apartheid era to create a, quote, pigmentation weapon that would target only black people, unquote. The research was abandoned when Nelson Mandela came to power, but at least two of the scientists who worked in the program in South Africa later moved to Israel. The idea of the Jewish state conducting such research has triggered alarm bells, not least because of the disturbing parallel with genetic experiments conducted by the Nazis. Didi Zucker, that's D-E-D-I, a member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is on record as saying, quote, we cannot be allowed to create such weapons, unquote. It was the raw materials for such weapons that an El Al jet was carrying on that October night in 1992. In its 114 tons of cargo that also included Sidewinder missiles and electronics were 12 barrels of DMMP, a component of sarin gas. The chemicals had been bought from Solkatronic, that's Solkatronic, the New Jersey-based chemical manufacturer. The company has steadfastly insisted it had been told by Israel the chemicals were, quote, to be used for testing gas masks, unquote. The institute was founded in 1952 in a small concrete bunker in an orchard. The fruit trees have long gone, replaced by a high concrete wall topped with sensors. Armed guards patrol the perimeter. Long ago, the institute disappeared from public scrutiny. Its exact address in the suburbs of Nes Ziona has been removed from the Tel Aviv telephone book. Its location is erased from all maps of the area. No aircraft is allowed to overfly the area. Only Dimona, Israel's nuclear facility in the Negev desert, is surrounded by more secrecy. In the classified directory of the Israeli Defense Force, the institute is only listed as, quote, providing services to the defense ministry, unquote. Concealed deep underground, the biochemists and genetic scientists work with their bottled agents of death, toxins that can create crippling food poisoning and lead to death, the even more virulent Venezuelan equine encephalomyelitis and anthrax. In other laboratories reached through airlocks, scientists worked with a variety of nerve agents, choking agents, blood agents, blister agents. These include tabun, T-A-B-U-N, virtually odorless and invisible when dispensed in aerosol or vapor form. Soman, the last of the Nazi nerve gases to be discovered, S-O-M-A-N, is also invisible in vapor form, but has a slightly fruity odor. The range of blister agents include chlorine, phosgene, and diphosgene, which smells of new mown grass. The blood agents include those with a cyanide base. The blister agents are based upon those first used in World War I. Outwardly featureless, with few windows in its dun-colored concrete walls, the Institute's interior has code words and visual identification control access to each area. Guards patrol the corridors. Bomb-proof sliding doors can only be opened by swipe cards, whose codes are changed every day. All employees undergo health checks every month. All have been subject to intense screening. Their families have also undergone similar checks. Within the Institute is a special department that creates lethal toxin weapons for the use of Mossad to carry out its state-approved mandate to kill without trial the enemies of Israel. Over the years, at least 6 workers at the plant have died, but the cause of their deaths is protected by Israel's strict military censorship. The first crack in that security curtain has come from a former Mossad officer, Viktor Ostrovsky. He claims that, quote, "We all knew that a prisoner brought to the Institute would never get out alive. PLO infiltrators were used as guinea pigs. They could make sure the weapons the scientists were developing worked properly and make them even more efficient," unquote. Israel has so far issued no denial of these allegations. Shu had confirmed all this and much more to his silent and undoubtedly shocked listeners in the CIA safe house. What he had described was far more disturbing than anything they had previously learned, which itself was precious little about the laboratories at the Institute. Suddenly, Washington must have seemed a long way from the sinister work going on in Israel. Shu had next described how the labs had developed another weapon with the help of the Chinese, which contravened all international treaties. These had begun to be used by special undercover IDF squads on the West Bank and in Gaza. The weapons included a variety of fast-acting poisons that left no trace unless a victim was subjected to minute examination by a specially trained pathologist. No fewer than 6 varieties of poison had been developed in the past 2 years. The first time the weapon was used was in September 1997, when a Mossad Kidon unit attempted to assassinate Hamas leader Khalid Meshal on an Amman, Jordan street. That operation was bungled by the team. Since then, chemists at the Institute had created more sophisticated delivery systems. These included powerful pistols that could fire such weapons at up to 50-meter range. On impact, the specially designed actual bullet head releases a needle-thin dart containing the poison. Israeli marksmen were taught not to fire at a target's head but into his body. All the poisons were fast-acting and leave no trace. The pistols that fired them were completely silent. The bullet that acts as the delivery system was designed to have minimum body penetration. The killing was done by the needle-like dart. It left no more than a pinprick. The Israelis calculated that in the mayhem of fighting in the West Bank and Gaza, no one would spot the pinprick. The full range of weapons supplied to the undercover teams included a number of nerve agents, choking agents, blood agents, and blister agents. All were designed to bring about quick deaths. Also available to the undercover teams were other killer gases that were strictly outlawed under international treaties. All these revelations had been transcribed and delivered on a daily basis to Tenet. Summaries had then been sent to the White House. The new president was said to be, quote-unquote, deeply disturbed by all he read. But more was to come from Shu. Comfortable in his safe house and with his debriefers, Shu began to widen the scope of his extraordinary knowledge. Unquote. All right, so that's the end of that section about China and Israel in Seeds of Fire. I believe, I don't think there's. Okay, here I can skip forward a little bit and we can read a little bit more about where it was down in South Africa. Or I could just continue reading through this a little bit more, or we could end here and then continue a little bit later.
We could read a little more if you'd like.
Yeah, let's read a little more because it goes into South Africa, but it's this Chinese knowledge of this. So it's China. It's a China, South Africa, and Israel, which is interesting here that maybe we should get a sense of.
Very interesting. I mean, this raises a lot of questions regarding China, South Africa. And, you would think like the People's Republic of China would be, in solidarity with the efforts to. It's interesting when you think about this, and then obviously the long-term relationship of Israel and South Africa. It's just another one of these, like what is actually going on regarding this. And of course, we've talked among ourselves about what appeared to have been like management of aspects of. Not just in the Middle East, but also throughout, like the what is known, for better or for worse, maybe not an entirely accurate term, but what is known as basically the the third world, or basically the countries that are in the Soviet solidarity. And I wonder, it makes me wonder, like this whole South Africa thing with Israel's relationship, the apartheid state of South Africa. What's actually going on in that regard as well? Was China genuinely. Is there something, or is there something else going on in terms of management of people that are of countries that are in groups that are basically in opposition to or seen as like being maybe more in line with goals of like the quote unquote communist world during the Cold War and after? I don't know, but it's interesting.
Yep. Okay. All right. Let's read a little bit more. I'm going to skip a part of this that has a bigger, what's called a wider panorama, and includes more American Chinese stuff that's, I think, important. But I just want to finish at least getting into some of this stuff with the Israel, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Bottom of page 482 of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America. Like all good intelligence officers, Xu continued by describing a visit he had made in January 2000 to Cape Town in South Africa. He had flown there from Tel Aviv via Johannesburg with Danny Yatom, once head of Mossad, but then Prime Minister Ehud Barak's personal security advisor, a watchdog to keep an eye on his old service's activities and those of other agencies within the Israeli intelligence community. Okay, so this is in 2000, January 2000. Okay. He and Yatom, I think it's Yatom, he and Yatom had traveled on false passports. Yatom's had been a British one, Xu's had a Thai document. Both identified them as quote-unquote businessmen. In Cape Town, Xu and Yatom had met with two Mossad Katzas, field agents, or officers, I think, in the city to monitor the activities of the growing number of Islamic fundamentalists in the country. Yatom had explained that had brought the total number of Mossad agents in South Africa to 7. They were supported by analysts at the newly reinforced quote-unquote desk at Mossad HQ. Initially, the two Katzas explained they had collaborated with South Africa's National Intelligence Agency, NIA, responsible for internal security, the country's poor relation version of the FBI. The intention had been to collaborate, Yatom had explained to Xu, on a shared intelligence basis. But following what the Katzas called an intelligence shambles over Islamic car bomb attacks in Cape Town against a number of foreign franchise companies in the city, Yatom had ordered the agents to break off collaborating with NIA. A Mossad report on the matter stated NIA, quote, is poorly led and that cooperation with its sister service, the South African Secret Service, SASS, is at a minimum. So great was the dissension that the country's already overburdened police force had created a special unit to do the work that NIA should be doing. The unit was called the Scorpion Force. Quote, but Mossad felt it lacked the essential prior knowledge that is a prerequisite for any successful intelligence gathering. In recent months, there had been a spate of car and pipe bombings in the city. The targets included a McDonald's, New York Bagels, and the city's popular Hard Rock Cafe. The attacks had been laid at the door of an extremist Muslim group, People Against Gangsterism and Drugs, PAGAD. Despite the effect they have had on foreign tourism, PAGAD gained a deal of sympathy with local people by driving out Cape Town's drug barons, who used the targets as meeting points to dispense their drugs, unquote. With the South African security services at loggerheads with each other, a situation the Mossad Qassas called the, quote, usual turf war that should have been resolved a long time ago, unquote, Mossad's presence in the country had led to renewed speculation. Mossad's presence in South Africa was a long-standing one. It began in 1972 when Ezer Weitzman, then a senior official in the Israeli Defense Ministry, met then Prime Minister P.W. Botha in Pretoria to further intelligence cooperation. At that time, South African security was in the hands of the notorious BOSS, the Bureau of State Security. It was Mossad who taught BOSS the more sophisticated means of interrogation that had worked for the Israelis in Lebanon: sleep deprivation, hooding, forcing a suspect to stand against a wall for long periods, squeezing genitalia, and a variety of mental tortures, including mock executions. Those were the halcyon days of Mossad's great African safari. One aside here, I believe that contact was probably earlier in the 60s, and I'm not sure about that, but I remember reading some other source that seemed to directly implicate an earlier relationship than what's being said here between Israel and South Africa. Okay, back to the text. Bottom of page 483, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Quote, then, when the apartheid regime finally ended, Mossad was among the first foreign intelligence services to offer its expertise to Nelson Mandela. It helped his fledgling regime target the white extremists Mossad had previously worked with. Jeez. Tenet then told Shu what had happened since he had arrived in Washington. The CSIS had begun an intensive search for Shu, quickly tracking him to Bangkok. CSIS agents in London and Europe were alerted in case Shu had chosen to defect to one of their security services. When it was discovered by a CSIS agent in New York that Shu had traveled directly to the United States, the Chinese government had reacted in typical fashion. Firstly, the Foreign Ministry asked the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, quote, for assistance in locating a Chinese military officer who had disappeared in New York, unquote. The implication was that Shu had been kidnapped either by the CIA or FBI and was being held under duress. The United States Embassy in Washington solemnly handed a diplomatic note to the Chinese Foreign Ministry that Shu was indeed in the United States but was in good health and, quote, had not been kidnapped, unquote. Stymied, the Chinese Foreign Ministry raised the matter with Admiral Dennis Blair, commander of the U.S. Pacific Forces, in a meeting in Beijing. Blair truthfully said he knew nothing of the episode, unquote. Okay, I think we'll leave it there for now, and we'll jump back to portions of this book as we digest more of it. I just one last thing. While we're on the topic here, there is this piece of the Plague Wars, a true story of biological warfare by Tom Mangold and Jeff Goldberg. At the end, it's just this one real quick reference to the Israeli and South African collaboration that I just want to read real briefly here. And this also then begins to suggest, what this whole array, this global biological warfare array, where there's deep aspects inside of the United States, but there's then also this, Israeli aspects, these Russian and Chinese aspects needs to be unpacked in terms of what's going down at this very moment in terms of COVID-19 potentially. So, all right, page 372, The Future, chapter 34 of Plague Wars, A True Story of Biological Warfare by Tom Mangold and Jeff Goldberg. The future, quote, genetic engineering for biological agents, there'd be no protection. These are the weapons of the future, and the future is coming closer and closer, unquote, by William Cohen, U.S. Secretary of Defense, 1998. Quote, in the autumn of 1998, the Western press reported that the Israelis were developing a so-called ethnic bullet, a genetically engineered biological weapon that would miraculously target only Arabs and not Jews. The story was a follow-up to an intriguing account first published in London by the reputable Foreign Report 2 years earlier. That report quoted the former head of Sweden's defense research establishment, General Bo Riebeck, as saying that genetic weapons might be around the corner. Riebeck speculated that influenza or diphtheria could be designed to affect only blacks, that a designer toxin could be aimed at Serbs, or that people with blue eyes might be given Alzheimer's disease. It was indeed speculative and provocative stuff, but from an authoritative source. In October 1998, Foreign Report followed through with an intriguing ethnic bullet story, which was then widely publicized. Quoting from unconfirmed South African sources, the magazine alleged that the, quote, ethnic bullet, unquote, had originally been a South African concept to deal with blacks during the apartheid era. Cooperation between South African and Israeli scientists was close during that period, and the article suggested that the Israelis had taken over the project after the South Africans terminated it in 1993. One of the Israeli conclusions was that there was a genetic difference between Arabs, particularly Iraqis, and both Ashkenazi, East European Jews, and Sephardim, Jews of Arabic origin. The Israeli scientists had also supposedly identified an illness that could be transmitted through Baghdad's water supply and affect only Iraqi Arabs. A senior aide to then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected the allegations, saying news reports proved there was no limit to human gullibility. Asked by the Associated Press if he was denying the story, the aide added, somewhat elliptically, quote, this is the kind of story that does not deserve a denial, unquote. The real truth behind all the politically motivated speculation is less dramatic, but in its own way far more troubling. The world has some 20 years, experts predict, before genetic engineering will effectively make biological warfare invulnerable to biological defense. Ken Alibek, who helped run the secret Soviet biological BW program, has warned that the Russians are trying to create a quote-unquote chimera virus, a horrendous marriage of Marburg and Ebola, which would combine the speed of infection of one with the lethality of the other. Science is now moving ahead so quickly and inexorably that there will be no natural or manufactured defense against a plague war other than a preemptive strike. It's as brutal as that. There are at least 4 new horizons for work on bacterial and viral agents, which most microbiologists believe will be scientifically attainable before the year 2020. All right, unquote. I'm going to stop there. And, you know, this, of course, this is a whole bunch of limited hangout too, but I just wanted to give another angle on that Israel-South African genetic bullet story. And then people can go look at Ken Alibek as a shady character now in an American context, specifically surrounding U.S. quote-unquote, so-called biodefense, but also biowarfare work. So, all right, that's it from me for now, I think, Greg, on this front.
Yeah, thank you for filling that in, and going back to what we were reading from earlier. I think that this whole matter, and we talked about like the nature of like not knowing like the depths and nature of like Chinese-Israel cooperation on these matters. But to me, like with the controversy around like the whole Xinjiang and China's treatment of its Uyghur population, and it makes me wonder, going back to the current events aspect of this, and we are going to do some we're going to go back in deep course to the nature geopolitically of Belt Road Initiative and China Israel. We're going to be reading from another passage, I believe, more going in that direction. But with regards to the current events in China, it's interesting to me that you have this history that I don't think has been covered anywhere else, and I wonder, like, some of the people out there, once again, I've got to zero in on some of these people, similar to, like, last show when I talked about those who don't want to raise serious questions about, Russia and Russia geopolitically, or how Russia operates in the world, or elements of, like, the Russian government, Russian aspects operate in the world, similarly to, will any of, like, these people that are so hell-bent, so adamant on pushing any criticism of China and what's going on with the Uyghur population, Xinjiang province, the involvement of people like Eric Prince, who is very close with these more, obviously, hardline combination of Zionist, hardline war on terror elements. I mean, right at the heart of that whole relationship. Are any of these people going to seek out this history of, of Israelis basically being trained in China on working on on biological warfare, ethnic specific targeted biological warfare devices? I mean, this is stuff that you would think, like, these people, these Max Blumenthals of the world, who are all about jumping on anything that Israel does, as far as, like, to the Palestinians, or any type of nefarious Israeli activities on that front, would be very interested in trying to follow up on this. But instead, they're out there telling people that all of this, any criticism of China as it relates to Uyghurs or anything else, is just simply CIA deep state regime change talking points, and you want to start a new world war if you try to not even just hold, like, China accountable for anything that might be going on in its own province, but even going further than that from a geopolitical global perspective, things that actually do affect, like, our countries. And I don't, I can speak as an American that these things, you and I, as we call ourselves patriotic Americans of conscience, that affect us, that affect our country. And so we need to, and I wonder, like, are any of these people going to seek out, like, looking into any of this history regarding, like, why are Israelis being trained in China on these ethnic warfare biological devices, and what does that have to do with the current events? And to me, this just seems like runs more credence to what we've been saying, that, like, China has been a direct beneficiary from the war, the so-called global war on terror, obviously after September 11th, but pre-September 11th as well, but definitely kicking into high gear, it seems like, in terms of domestically with regards to domestic Chinese operations, certainly in the aftermath of September 11th. So this, to me, just lends more credence in that direction, and this fact that, like, I'm getting a bit on my soapbox here, but, like, that we're not supposed to talk about this, is just really infuriating.
Yeah, we need to talk about this and more, and because the thing is as long as there's this vacuum where it's sort of between, it's Tom Cotton and Steve Bannon, and Danny Shoham or something like that on one side, and then on the other side, you basically, it's like the Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate types, where you can't sort of, or maybe even like the Martins, you can't sort of say anything, and then in the midst of that is a vacuum of real geopolitics. And similarly, in the way that all these fingers of these sort of the previous generation of the Tom Cotton types, but even some of these, we'll start pulling the actual references of these same so-called journalists who are pointing the finger at Iraq for anthrax are the ones who are pointing the finger only at China in relationship to the quote-unquote lab leak theory of Wuhan, and now you even see Jon Stewart sort of getting into the mix and sort of saying, "There's the name of the thing of the virus is right there, and it just how could it not be there? Having leaked from there." And meanwhile, similarly, that in the vacuum of dealing with like this actual history, including the deep history, the sort of the Chinese deep state. It's not just the U.S. and the West that has a deep state. And a lot of this there are these global machinations going on here to understand. But that even in the midst of not understanding that, you create a vacuum where the Tom Cottons can point the finger at the Chinese, and we get distracted from the fact that there was this gain of function research, quote unquote, that was done under the guise of defense at some level, even though it's really just ongoing biological warfare programs that were ramped up again post-September 11th. Remember, there was that reference to ethno-specific bioweapons in the Project for a New American Centuries, Rebuilding America's Defense. It didn't only say, absence of New Pearl Harbor, that this was going to be a long, quote unquote, transition or something like that, but it also talked about ethno-specific bioweapons going from the things of terrorists to politically useful tools. I think it's something like the language of that. So meanwhile, if we don't actually deal with some of this deeper, darker history of, for example, this Chinese-Israeli relationship, it's not quite clear exactly the specific of the ethno-specific, how much they collaborated specifically on that, or whether it was just the deployment. I think we need to dig a little bit more into that. But the specifics of that, the Chinese were collaborating with Israel while Israel was really focused on ethnic specific bioweapons and deep in collaboration with the South Africans is crucial to understand. And then, because that then fits in a lot of more, history that needs to be understood, so we can then also then take a look at, okay, what happened at Fort Detrick in the summer of 2019? What is the relationship of the restarting of the quote unquote gain of function programs by people like Anthony Fauci under Trump that had been stopped towards the end of the Obama administration, in relationship to such papers coming out of Ralph Barrick's lab at University of North Carolina, where they published a paper basically describing a chimeric virus that had a lot of the features of exactly what we see in relationship to SARS-CoV-2. And it's an open history now that even the Wuhan lab, that specific Wuhan lab, the level 4 laboratory there's other laboratory there too, but that the level 4 laboratory there had very obvious relationships with the bowels of the U.S. quote unquote defense establishment and these research projects that were then facilitated over there. So there's a lot to unpack in terms of the geopolitics of how this has all gone down and evolved to this moment. And we have to deal with the fact that China is a key player, at the very least, in quote unquote taking advantage of the war on terror. At the very, very, very least, okay? They, along with Russia, of course, with the apartment bombings and bringing in Putin and the Chechen wars and all of that, Russia is very directly, overtly involved in the war on terror. But as you pointed out, these questions of Xinjiang in terms of China and how it's actually quote unquote solving its Muslim problem in that way, and its regional cultural problem, or what, the way that it might see it, is part and parcel of holding the global criminal war on terror to account. And meanwhile, we can also then hold to account the treasonous acts done on our land here in the United States in terms of September 11th and who did it and why. And so this all can be done, and I would say all this must be done so that we can actually clarify both how we got here and then how we might be able to move from truth towards accountability. And that through the door of accountability is where hope for the future lies.
Yes, accountability that both holds accountable our very own, corrupt elements from within, but at the same time also, true accountability does not allow for people basically to perpetually continue to propagate the war on terror in the name of just like of
axis of resistance.
Yes, axis of resistance, just simply opposing anything the U.S. does in the world. While meanwhile, it's very clear that like the the Russian factor in Syria is very much perpetuating the war on terror, even under the name of they're there to kill and take out the terrorists that basically the Americans and the West created. And then similarly in it's interesting how you could say that very much the people who are that the voices of Syrians and who speak up, who are opposed to this, are basically discounted in the same way. You'll see some of the talking points, like all the things that China is actually doing. It sounds very much like apologists for, and we've talked about this before. I think we talked about this in our interview with Spokesman a couple months back. The way the American it sounds very much like American apologists. And, everything's okay here in America. We don't have a race problem. Look at all of the advancements that are being made, and a lot of apologists as regards will sound the same way.
We have black CEOs.
Yes, exactly, and there might be there's Uyghur celebrities in China. There's Palestinian celebrities in Israel. I mean, there's nothing to worry about.
Yeah, right.
And so I'm getting on another tangent here as we begin to wrap up here. But all of that does to me, it seems like, and of course, me not being on the ground in China, obviously, I don't want to try to speak out of my league on this, but I mean, I could see from American perspective that you have what we know about the way that the global war on terror has been perpetuated within these networks, that. Very much like the defense and the apologetics are very similar to what you'd hear here in the U.S. on a domestic scale.
All right, and so maybe for our next installment of our Antedote Deepcore Text in an Israel and China capacity, we'll then move back into a book titled Israel and China: From Silk Road to Innovation Highway, by Lionel Friedfeld and Philippe Metudi, Understanding Asia's Relationship with the Jewish State. And so there's some readings that I've selected from there, and then maybe during that we can also then delve back into this interesting article in the journal Logic, published May 1st, 2019, titled Ghost World, by Darren Byler. In Northwest China, the state is using technology to pioneer a new form of terror capitalism. Maybe we can reach the anti-imperialists and some of the left, the left of good faith, by reading about China's new form of terror capitalism.
All right, sounds good. And thanks for we finally got back on this topic here of Deep Core China, and we'll definitely be following up on this. And so yeah, hopefully we are able to at the very least put out information that I think we're putting out information that hasn't been covered in a lot of places that really can help to figure out a better understanding of what really seems to be going on a geopolitical basis, and trying to figure out some of these a lot of cases hidden, not so covered, not so elaborated upon history, that I think really can answer a lot of questions regarding, and it continues to answer questions that are related to what happened in this country and what happened throughout Europe and what's been going on the globe. And a lot of this, I'll go back to this. The phrase that I believe it was Bernie Sanders writing about. I believe I believe it was in the Guardian. The global axis of authoritarianism, throwing in China, throwing in Israel, throwing in Russia. It's very interesting, this obsession with ethnic politics and the ethnic bioweapons and all of this. I mean, it puts another aspect on this global that I think the really serious analysts in a lot of cases in our circles are just frowned upon as being deep state or whatever, really I think do understand is that there is a common thread among these countries and among these entities that are very much, I think, responsible for or benefited from the rise of people like Donald Trump. So
yeah, and then once you get into this global axis of authoritarianism, and you bring it back home to the United States, then you really then begin to get into these elements, like you said, that helped install Trump, and where you get into the core of the CNP and all those types in terms of the long-term really war on American democracy from the inside, additionally. And so we'll touch on that in maybe not a text-centric show.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeremy.
All right. Thank you, Greg. All right. Until next time, Antedote. We out.